Bismillah walhamdulillah wa salatu wa salam ala rasulillah. In this presentation, we want to deal with the fiqh of da'wah, understanding some of the principles which should guide da'wah or should guide Islamic education in its general sense and in its specific sense. In its general sense, it's just educating people about Islam so that they have the correct understanding. And in its specific sense, what it means is a thorough, rigorous Islamic education and the Quran and the Sunnah and for life. Here, we want to consider the ayat of the Quran in which Allah says, لَقَدْ كَرَّمْنَا بَنِي آدَمَ. Certainly we have honored the children of Adam, 1770. 17th chapter of the Quran, the 70th ayat or verse. This is an ayat which should fundamentally, constantly guide our interaction and our thinking. We live in a globalized world, in a society which is pluralistic, and we will encounter people that differ with us. So how do we engage them, especially when we disagree on some of their moral preferences or choices? We have to always consider that Allah Tabaraka wa Ta'ala created the human being in dignity. This is a Quranic teaching. It may be the case that we don't agree with their particular choice, but we ourselves have to engage those people in a way which upholds the dignity of the human being. And that would require a further study in and of itself in regards to interacting with those we differ with. And that's not the topic here to be dealt with or treated in depth. I just want to indicate to some of the essential things which are necessary for understanding da'wah. But that in itself is a worthy investigation, how to uphold the dignity of the human being when we differ with that person morally, which is different than differing with someone intellectually, or different than even differing with a person based on creed. Because it may be the case that we differ on creed, but we have a similar moral platform that we function out of. In any event, we want to always consider that in our interactions, we want to take this as obligatory upon ourselves. We should always treat people in a manner which recognizes their dignity. This is a Quranic principle which can be translated into a philosophical principle to guide our thought, and then fundamentally into an ethical principle to guide our action. Now, what's necessary in da'wah, and da'wah takes on multiple forms, but here we want to talk very, very briefly about two types. General da'wah, which is just informing people about Islam and the reality of Islam, and encouraging people to investigate more. And specific or specialized da'wah, which is dealing with educating people on specific issues of Islam, and that has two parts: a rigorous Islamic education and informing people at a deeper level regarding a particular issue that relates to Islam, but with depth and discipline. Any interpretation that we have of Islam, whether it is regarding da'wah in its general sense or in a specific sense, whether it pertains to a rigorous Islamic education or whether it pertains to educating people on a particular issue regarding Islam or related to Islam with depth, demands that we have a principal textual interpretation. A principal textual interpretation. And this refers to this: that we always consider the objectives of the Sharia and our understanding of the Quran and the Sunnah, and that we don't accept interpretations of the Quran except if they are arrived at by al-Qawaid al-Usuliyah or Usul al-Fiqh or Islamic jurisprudence. So everybody's not qualified to interpret the Quran and the Sunnah. It's open for a democratic interpretation, meaning people have the right to interpret if they meet these conditions. There's no such thing as a priesthood in Islam being initiated into scholarship so that one is only accepted within the circle of scholars if a body of priests give that person a designation. No. What ranks someone as a scholar in Islam is merit in scholarship. Yeah, there's a recognition there, but there's no initiation. So there's a difference between scholarship in Islam and the notion of priesthood. So it's not a free-for-all, in other words. Everybody's not qualified to interpret the Quran and the Sunnah, no matter what they believe and what they think and what comes from their desires. Because if we allow this to be the case, that everybody is entitled to an interpretation of the Quran, what we find is interpretations of the Quran which violate the very values of the Sharia, which violate the very principle which we established in the beginning, and that is recognizing the dignity of the human being, right? And we recognize the interpretations which are not grounded in the objectives of the Sharia. They are 6 in number: the preservation and the cultivation of our understanding of the values of Islam, preservation and cultivation of life, preservation and cultivation of intellect, preservation and cultivation of family life, preservation and cultivation of wealth, preservation and cultivation of human dignity, the dignity of the human being. So when having an interpretation which is not grounded in the objectives of the Sharia or the principles of interpretation which are recognized by the scholars of Islam throughout the ages, we don't necessarily have to agree with their interpretations, because interpretation changes with time and place, but we fundamentally have to subscribe to the principles that are used for interpretation, lest we have havoc and we wreak havoc by the interpretations that we espouse or that we take on or that we come to conclude. And this is what will eliminate some of the madness that we see in the community, that is that we demand the interpretation of the Quran and the Sunnah be grounded in the maqasid of the Sharia wal qawaid al usuliyya or usul al fiqh. And this is for every person engaged in da'wah, to make sure that we spread this concept that interpretations of Islam must be grounded in the objectives of the Sharia and usul al fiqh. So da'wah that's not grounded in this reality, so education in general which is not grounded in this reality, is an education which will lead to problematic results, because it will lead to the disintegration of our understanding of Islam. And Islam has certain objectives that it comes to realize, and they were mentioned in brief. And for further study, I advise you to understand the science which is called Ilmul Maqasid, or the Maqasid of the Sharia, or the objectives of the Sharia. And there are quite a few number of well-written books and articles in this matter in the English language. Secondly, with that understanding in mind, we need to begin to approach a concept in which there's an intellectual formation and a demand for intellectual maturity in our community. In other words, thinking has to be along guidelines. There's a procedure that needs to be there in place which cultivates our thought. If a person just believes without really understanding what is the underlying foundation of that belief and how that belief is supposed to have an impact on society, and that human beings require that we recognize their dignity and so on and so forth, his thought or her thought is going to be fundamentally skewed, distorted, ungrounded as a Muslim, rooted in ignorance. So we need to be able to encourage that thinking is a process which requires principles. And not only that, but there's a certain refinement that's required in thought. It's not just an issue of I know, you don't know, I'll prove you wrong, and so on and so forth. There has to be a certain degree of maturity. So in da'wah, we require then that we train our intellects. We train our intellects, and that also needs a discussion in and of itself. But fundamentally, the idea has to be put in place. We can differ on methodology, but fundamentally we should at least agree that in da'wah, there has to be an intellectual formation that takes place. There has to be a moving towards maturity in thought, how we think about things. And that thought is grounded by understanding Islamic sciences, is formed by understanding Islamic sciences, it's formed by a mentor relationship, a mentorship, a spiritual and intellectual mentorship between teacher and student, allowing people to come to understand and get a grasp of Islam on their own. A lot of times leads to this being a neglected principle, as much as it leads to neglecting principle textual interpretation, because the understanding of the scholars of usul al-fiqh and maqasid of the sharia, or the objectives of the sharia and Islamic jurisprudence, requires that a mind be trained in how to think about issues when interpreting the Quran and the Sunnah and interpreting those values into life. So we want to pay attention to the necessary principle, that thinking and thought should be formed, and it should reach a level of maturity before people begin to speak about Islam. And the issue of grounded spirituality comes to the fore, along with understanding that there's a system of interpretation and there's a demand for our intellects to be formed. There's also a demand for a spirituality which is grounded. We don't want a spirituality which is neglectful of the creation, a spirituality which is world denying. We want a spirituality which allows the human being as a whole to be able to be productive emotionally, intellectually, socially, and further. So here, a grounded spirituality means that we have to deal with some of our very demons, some of our vices. So da'wah should be an approach which allows people to see that they can be liberated from their vices and don't have to be slaves to their vices. So the person doing da'wah and the da'wah that's communicated should be one which is grounded in a sound, balanced spirituality, not one which it generates or encourages hatred for the creation in the world and life, but one which actually embraces that which is positive in the creation, because it is created in goodness and in wisdom, because it is the creation of Allah. So approaching human beings, approaching the creation, the universe, and approaching society in a way in which we see that it's a blessing from Allah and we recognize the positives is important in our spirituality. But spirituality which is grounded on everything being prohibited and everything being overridden by the hand of the devil is one which will fundamentally undermine the belief of the person, fundamentally will weaken the belief of the person, because interacting in life will be so difficult that it will become the interaction of a person that is dysfunctional, a person that doesn't know how to address life problems. So intellectual maturity requires that we understand that Islam has principles to interpret the text, and also that our spirituality should be grounded in the wholeness of the human being. It should be grounded in the values of Islam, and Islam is a life-embracing way of life religion. We should also understand social problems. So we should have a principled spiritual understanding of social problems. We shouldn't allow ourselves to be open to conspiratorial theories or anarchical concepts or militarist notions of social problems. Regardless of how they're started, we can come to understand how problems are started historically, how social problems are generated, how they emerge. But our results, our conclusion, our approach to their solution can't be grounded in that reality. It has to be grounded on a principle understanding of Islam, which always keeps in mind human dignity. So our understanding of social problems is not that we stay lost, is not so that we stay lost or immersed in the negativity which comes from seeing the negatives of human and social life. But our understandings of social problems should give us a sense of empowerment, a sense of responsibility of what now we have to do in order to make life better, in order to be able to carry out the values of Islam, which should be productive and which should lead to generating solutions for human issues, human problems. if we find ourselves that we're following a principle textual interpretation, and our intellect is becoming formed so that it reaches some degree of maturity, and our spirituality is grounded, and our understanding of social problems is one which always keeps us hopeful, because the human being and human nature is good because Allah created it thus, and now we should move towards having a social concern and ensuring that there's a connectedness there. So the first four principles in Dawah are about forming the individual. The fifth principle now is moving from individual formation towards social formation. And of course, we're not saying that these things necessarily follow in stages and steps, because they may require that we engage one principle first before the other, but we at least want to have an understanding of these principles, that the end result should be that we have a social concern and connectedness, that we be grounded in our understanding of Islam, and it be one which always considers human dignity and recognizes it. Consideration of human dignity and recognizing it are two different issues that are interrelated. Consideration of human dignity means that in our understanding, we always have to think about the upliftment of human beings. We always have to think about the upliftment of human beings, and that we recognize human dignity requires that in our interaction, in our action, that our thinking moves from thought to a way of engaging the world. In our engagement, that all our actions constantly affirm our belief that the human being is an honored creation. So if our action violates that, then we need to see how our thought can bridge the gap in our action and overcome the deficiency or the vacuum in principle, and inform our action with the idea that the human being is dignified or honored by Allah. So our thinking, our considerations should always keep in mind human dignity. Then in our action, that always should be translated as a universal reality when we deal with all human beings. Because it may be the case that we think this to be a reality, but then we're very preferential in the way that we deal with people, and so our practice falls short, and we may consider that it is viable to recognize the dignity in one type of person but not in another type of person. This doesn't necessarily mean that we have to agree with the moral decisions or orientation that a person has, but it does essentially mean that we have to recognize the human dignity, that Allah Tabaraka wa Ta'ala honored them. So some of the essentials of Dawah then are that we begin to ground ourselves in an understanding of the Quran and the Sunnah, which is principled and always aimed at having a social concern and rectifying relationships between human beings in one way or another, but always being informed by this ayat of the Quran. Certainly we have honored the children of Adam, and the best way to come to understand how the children of Adam are honored is by studying the life of the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, the one who interacted with enemy and friend in such a way that their dignity was always recognized. أقول قولي هذا واستغفر لي ولكم والحمد لله رب العالمين.